Okay, welcome once again to another episode of Jammin' Dude's Neighborhood. Next in my series of Odd Logic reviews. Hey, you know what? I've got a substitute co-host this week. You want to know what? I want to introduce you to one of my new best friends, Mr. Johnny Walker. You know, I might become a Scotchman after this. This stuff is nice. It's a little outside of my price range. I'm just a poor construction worker, but anyway, on with the show. Today's episode is going to focus on Over the Underworld. Now, this is a really interesting beast. I would have to say that this is simultaneously one of, how could I say it? When I have listened to this album like 30 times, shuffling through it, and I have to say that as a listening experience, you're not quite sure what is going on. As a straight up listening album, when you're just listening to it on your headphones, it's a little tough to wrap your head around. But the fact of the matter is that this album is not really a proper Odd Logic album. This was a little bit more of an experiment. This album is intended to be an alternative soundtrack to the what year did that film come out? Underworld, Kate Beckinsale, vampire, werewolf thing movie. And I have to say that after about 30 times of listening to it, I came downstairs, and Sean was nice enough to send me a copy of the movie because I don't own a copy of the movie. And truth be told, I'm full confession here. I'm a man. In my personal life, I am completely a man of peace. I don't judge anybody else. You do your thing. But for me, I'm not into a bunch of blood and blah, yuck, and, it's not my thing. But I managed to obtain a copy of Underworld. And this movie was intended to be synced up at a certain point of the film. It was about the 45-minute mark. And act as an alternate soundtrack and to sync up with the film up through its conclusion. As you're sitting there watching the movie and listening to Sean's stream of thought, as it carries you through the movie. The lyrics are describing the action. The music is hitting on certain points. This goes way beyond. This is one of the most incredible progressive metal experiments. I almost respect this more than the accidental sync-ups that we get from, Dark Side of the Moon versus the Wizard of Oz, and then I've even seen the one that's kind of neat with 2112 syncing up with a section of Willy Wonka. It's kind of cool and all, but some of it is a bit of a stretch. Yeah, some of it's cool, but some of it's a bit of a stretch. Because this is fully intentional, this syncs up at every little tiny moment. It is actually a revisualization of the film itself. And I think on that level, it's one of the most brilliant progressive metal experiments I've ever heard in my entire life. And as a soundtrack for the movie, you really have to see this. If you are already a fan of this genre and this film, you would be doing yourself a tremendous disservice by not putting these things together. Now, as a listening album, it is a little tougher because it is intended to be a soundtrack. And actually, to tell you the truth, if you're into soundtracks, you'd probably just love this. You just have to approach it from the standpoint that this album is intended to be more of a soundtrack to a film, not a proper album. But in that way, it carries its own themes. It's almost a single piece because as I was listening to it as individual tracks. Of those, How Are Things Progressing really opens up the album really well. And it begins some of the themes. It almost works like an incredibly long, 12 minutes? 15, 16 minutes? 12 minutes? Oh my God, you caught me without my glasses. Like 12 minutes long, and you catch some of the overtures that you'll hear later. And it sets up the album properly. Now, from there, we head into the second track, Not Anymore, which to me is probably the one piece that I would say you could include as a singular contained song that you could listen to on its own. The main riff is got an incredible hook. It's very memorable, and it has a theme contained within itself. So if I were to try to put together a compilation of the best of Odd Logic that tried to represent all of their albums, Not Anymore, I think, would be the best representation from this album as being a song into and of itself that really works by itself. I could see Not Anymore being performed live on its own more than the other songs from this album. Having said that, as it started to get more into Stick 'em and Move, 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 which you'd have to see it to believe it. But even the way that little motions are thrown together, you really can't appreciate all the work and meticulous attention to detail that would have gone into syncing up little points of the music to little things that are going on in the movie. And when you're listening to them on their own, they sound like blind shifts out of nowhere. But when you're watching it with the movie, everything makes perfect sense because every tone, every note, every crunch, every punch, it all syncs up with something. The film perfectly and seamlessly mixes up with the music in such a beautiful way, and it really makes for an incredible soundtrack. And I especially liked, and I thought I had noticed this as I was listening on, as I had listened to this album several times, but not necessarily all the way through on its own. I was picking out tracks and listening to them individually so that I could pick them up. But I was sitting here watching the movie and listening to the album all the way through. And what I suspected was true is we get to track 4, Move, Move, Move. It's almost like this was a point where I felt that Sean hit on a moment that was very much like the Soon section of Gates of Delirium by Yes. And there's this theme near the end, this I've come to save you. It's this very, very tender moment that I just think is one of the most beautiful melodies that Odd Logic has ever come up with. And it's contained on this album, and it fits with the way that certain characters are interacting with one another during the film. And then it repeats itself on the epic final track, Soon I Will Become the Hunted, the 20.5-minute piece that ends the album, which thematically brings the story and the album all together, and really does an incredible job of both. Excuse me, but Johnny to my rescue. Oh, he may be my new best friend. But the way it ties everything together at the end, while not in and of itself being like, we're used to 20-minute pieces from, like, let's face it, from Yes, from Dream Theater, and we're used to having these running themes that go through to make an epic piece like that a self-contained piece. Transatlantic, Yes, Dream Theater, Spock's Beard, etc., etc., etc. They've all done it, but they all tried to make it like a classical piece where it has a beginning and ending. And this, because this is acting more as a soundtrack, the 20-minute epic piece that ends this album is not really self-contained, but rather wraps up the themes that are contained in the rest of the album. So in that way, this is not so much a 20-minute epic piece that's meant to be listened to on its own, but this entire album is meant to be like a 1 hour plus epic piece that is almost like a completely self-contained classical piece with running themes throughout the entire thing. You know, I could go on and on and on, but suffice to say that as an album, this is my least favorite Odd Logic album. But as a thematic piece and as a piece of experimental progressive metal, this is one of the most brilliant pieces of art I've ever heard. And so I would say that if you are a fan of Underworld especially, you really need to do yourself a favor and pick up Over the Underworld, sync it up with the movie in the proper place, kick back with your own co-host of your choice, and enjoy. Next, we are going to be heading into the Manta albums. I'm not sure how I'm going to be tackling this, but we have a 2 CD concept piece that's coming up next, and I'm not sure if I want to continue in my backwards progression, which would mean I would do part 2 and then do part 1, or if I just take a little extra time and do them both at once. I haven't made up my mind yet. But until then, please continue to check out Odd Logic, one of absolutely the most unsung progressive metal bands in the world today. Check out their page, buy their albums, do whatever it takes, but get your hands on this stuff. It's absolutely brilliant. And keep tuning in. And thanks for tuning in. And hey, share with me any new progressive rock you're hearing too, because I'd love to hear it. I'm in a stage where I'm pretty happy and open to new things, and starting to listen to all sorts of stuff, starting to get happy again. So you guys take care of yourself, prog on, and I'll see you next time on Jammin' Dude's Neighborhood.